The candle burned low, its wax pooling silently on the cold stone floor. The Tower of London, quiet now, but never still, breathed with the weight of centuries. Somewhere in the bowels of its fortress walls, where secrets rotted and loyalty flickered like flame, Anne Boleyn opened her eyes. The hour was cruel, before dawn when even the crows slept, but she was already awake. Had she slept at all? She rose from her straw-matted pallet, her breath a thin fog in the air. Her hands trembled as they reached for the edges of her cloak, still folded with the care of a queen who refused to be unmade by circumstance. No crown adorned her head now, only a linen coif pressed gently against her scalp, as if to contain the thoughts that had raged there for 17 days. She had been a queen, not merely by title, but by presence, razor-witted, regal, radiant. The court had either adored or feared her, and often both. But now she was a woman reduced to bone and memory. She knelt slowly, each joint a reminder that dignity must be chosen, not given. The stone beneath her knees was unforgiving, but she welcomed its sting. It kept her tethered to the world that still demanded her blood. Outside her chamber, the corridor stirred. Footsteps, not hurried, not hesitant, just inevitable. She tilted her head as if listening would somehow change the pace of history. A murmur passed beyond the door. Perhaps it was the priest. Perhaps it was the swordsman. She had been promised a clean death, as if such a thing existed. Anne's lips moved in silent prayer, though whether to God or memory, even she did not know. Her thoughts scattered. Elizabeth, the daughter she would never see again. Henry, the man who had broken kingdoms to possess her. And the silence of every noble who once swore eternal loyalty now turned mute in their safety. She prayed not for salvation, but for clarity. A last truth before steel and silence swallowed her. The torch outside her door flickered. Shadows danced against the walls like spirits mocking the living. The steps grew closer. She did not flinch. Queens do not flinch, even when the court has chosen to forget their coronation robes and remember only the whispered sins. This was not an execution. It was a dismantling, not of a body, that would be the swordsman's task, but of an identity, a narrative, a threat. Anne Boleyn had become too dangerous to leave intact. She had spoken too freely, challenged too publicly, risen too quickly from nowhere to throne, and that, in Henry's England, was a crime without pardon. The door creaked open. No words, just eyes, watching, measuring. She stood with a grace that hadn't yet abandoned her, and nodded. It was time, not for justice, nor for repentance, but for theater, because that's what it was now. A carefully arranged final act. The props had been laid, the lines rehearsed, and the audience summoned. She was led through narrow stone corridors where the air smelled of damp wood, iron, and the ghosts of men who had knelt here before. Outside, the sky was dull gray, a smothered sun cloaked in mourning. A slight breeze carried the scent of smoke and wet grass, a strange perfume for a day of death. The courtyard waited. Guards stiffened as she passed, as if posture could hide discomfort. She saw it in their eyes, the tension between duty and doubt. None dared meet her gaze for long. She walked upright, shoulders square, every step calculated to remind them, "You are not killing a criminal. You are executing a queen." The scaffold came into view like a forgotten altar. Wooden, plain, elevated for spectacle. Around it, the small crowd gathered in silence. Not the masses. This was not a peasant's death. These were courtiers, officials, careful witnesses. Each had a reason to be present, and not a single one was clean. Anne ascended the steps slowly, her skirts brushing the wood with soft whispers. The executioner was there already, a man from France, chosen for his sword and precision. He did not bow. He only watched, and she did not blink. The priest approached, offering final rites. She accepted, but not in fear. It was not her soul she doubted. It was theirs. The ones who watched. The ones who planned. The ones who signed her fate with hands that shook behind velvet robes. She turned to speak, and the wind caught her voice just enough to carry it. She praised the king, as custom dictated. She denied no guilt, but admitted no sin. And then she did the most terrifying thing a condemned woman could do. She smiled. A calm, unflinching smile that cut through the theater like broken glass. She knelt upright. No block, only air and fate. The blindfold was tied, darkness wrapping around her face like a second skin. Her lips moved again, not trembling this time, but steady. Her last words were for God, for mercy, for forgiveness, and perhaps for revenge that history would grant in whispers long after the crowd had scattered. The sword did not fall yet. That would come later. For now, time held its breath. The tower loomed behind her. The crowd watched in silence, and Anne knelt in her final moment of clarity, not as victim, not as villain, but as the woman England could not forget, no matter how carefully it tried to erase her. The steps behind her whispered again. The play was nearly over. She hadn't been born to wear a crown, but Anne Boleyn didn't wait for history's permission. She carved her place into the heart of power with wit sharper than any blade and eyes that saw through every pageant and pretender. In a world where women were meant to smile and fade, Anne ignited. Not with obedience, but with voltage. She wasn't just beautiful. She was dangerous, because she knew how to think, how to speak, and worst of all, how to make a king listen. Long before the scaffold, before the tower, before the whisper of treason danced through the halls, Anne had stood triumphant. She wasn't Henry's first love, but she was the one who made him rip the world apart. For her, he broke with Rome. For her, he warred with his conscience and crowned himself the church. For her, England was torn from the Pope like a page ripped from a holy book. That kind of passion has a cost, and Anne paid it in full. When she first arrived at court, she was the younger sister of a royal mistress, a curiosity with French manners and a lightning tongue. But Anne didn't want to orbit power. She wanted to become it. She saw through Henry's desires like glass. She refused him not with coldness but with calculation. Not now. Not yet. Not until the crown was hers. And so she made herself untouchable until he couldn't bear not to have her. Years of tension followed. Years of Henry unraveling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a queen beloved by the people, a wife who refused to vanish. Anne watched kingdoms bend around her refusal. She watched herself become the son of the Tudor court, every noble's ambition recalibrating toward her rising star. The court whispered her name with a mixture of awe and disgust. The concubine, they called her. The whore. And yet every eye followed her into every hall. When at last she was crowned, Anne had already been hated by half of England and feared by the other, but she walked with a spine of steel, pregnant with a future king who would silence every doubter. Instead, Elizabeth was born, a daughter, a disappointment, a prophecy reversed. Still, Anne didn't buckle. She leaned into the role of queen with all the elegance and edge she possessed. She was bold, she interceded in affairs of state, she argued theology, she mocked the old traditions. She planted Protestant seeds that Henry didn't fully understand, and worst of all, she didn't fade into quiet servitude. She spoke too often. She laughed too loudly. She threatened too many of the wrong men with her mind. At first, Henry admired it. He was intoxicated by the fire he had kindled. But kings don't love equals, they love mirrors. Anne stopped reflecting Henry's glory and started exposing his insecurities. Every disagreement became a challenge, every miscarriage a disappointment, every confident speech a reminder that the woman he had crowned was not the woman he could control. There is a particular terror in realizing you've built your kingdom around someone smarter than you. Henry wasn't just threatened, he was humiliated. Anne didn't obey the silent scripts of queenship. She debated bishops. She scorned courtiers. She dared to laugh in the presence of power, not from its shadow. And so the tide turned. Anne's enemies, once silent, began to circle. They had been waiting for this moment. The court thrives on weakness. The same nobles who toasted her rise sharpened their knives the moment her confidence began to waver. Her inability to produce a male heir became more than misfortune. It became evidence of sin, of divine disfavor, of witchcraft, if one squinted hard enough. Henry, for all his authority, was not a god. He bled, he aged, he doubted. And when he looked at Anne, he no longer saw a queen. He saw the cracks, the miscarriages, the arguments. The independence that once seduced him now mocked him. And nearby, a soft-eyed lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour curtsied with the perfect blend of silence and submission. To remove Anne would not be enough. If she were merely dismissed or exiled, her voice would echo through Europe. Her allies might plot. Her daughter might rise. No, Anne needed to be destroyed so thoroughly that history would hesitate to speak her name. Her influence had to be dismembered, not just erased. But the public wouldn't accept a quiet vanishing, so they staged a spectacle. Treason, incest, adultery. Charges so grotesque, so implausible, they were designed to stain not only Anne, but everything she touched. Her friends were arrested. Her music master, her brother, even a court poet, dragged into the web. The court didn't need truth, it needed submission. Confessions were shaped with threats and torture. The truth didn't matter anymore. The script had been written, and Anne would be forced to play her part. Still, she held her head high. Even as the walls narrowed, even as her allies disappeared, even as Henry stopped visiting. She refused to beg, refused to admit guilt. She knew her death would be used to cauterize the memory of her reign. But she also knew something Henry never understood. Symbols are harder to kill than bodies. Anne had rewritten what it meant to be queen, and no amount of blood could unwrite that. In the end, Henry needed Anne dead, not because she had failed him, but because she had revealed him. She had exposed the limits of his charm, the cracks in his piety, the hunger behind his authority. She had reminded the world that even a king can be outmatched, not by armies or rivals, but by the sharp, unyielding will of a woman who dared to rule beside him, not beneath him. The walls of the Tower of London don't echo, they absorb. And in May of 1536, those walls swallowed every gasp, every whisper, every unanswered prayer from the woman once called queen. Anne Boleyn entered her prison not in chains, but wrapped in a dignity that still clung to her like perfume, though the scent of rot and betrayal hung heavier in the air. 17 days. That's how long they gave her, not to defend herself. There was never going to be a trial that listened, but to unravel. Piece by piece, day by day. They placed her in the Queen's lodgings, not a cell, as if to pretend this was merely a pause in the pageantry. But Anne knew. The silence told her. The room was still, suffocating. The same rooms where she had once prepared for her coronation now stood as tombs for her crown. The windows, high and narrow, let in slivers of light, never enough to see, always enough to hope. At first she waited, for word, for Henry, for reason. But the letters didn't come. The king did not call, only guards and rumors. The lady who brought her food wouldn't look her in the eye. The priest spoke in riddles. Even the birds outside her window had grown quiet, as if God himself had turned his face away. The list of accusations, when it came, read like a carnival of delusion. Adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, plotting the king's death. Anne laughed when she first heard it. Short, sharp, involuntary. It was so absurd, so desperate. But the laughter cracked something in her. Not because it was untrue, but because she knew it didn't have to be true. Not anymore. Guilt was no longer the measure. Only usefulness. The men named, Smeaton, Norris, Weston, Brereton, George Boleyn, were friends, allies, brothers in spirit, if not blood. She had danced with them, joked with them, leaned on them. Now they were arrested, interrogated, twisted into symbols of her downfall. Some confessed, some denied. It didn't matter. Confessions were currency in a trial without justice, and silence was taken as proof. Her brother, George, intelligent, elegant, a mirror of her ambition. She imagined him now, shackled, beaten, forced to confess things that curled the skin of the court in mock outrage. Incest, treason. The scripts were so vile, they could only have been written by men desperate to justify what they already decided. Anne's solitude grew thicker by the hour. Each day chipped away at the edges of her mind, not with brutality, but with precision. She was given time to think, to imagine, to wonder how the world had turned so quickly. The women assigned to attend her, spies in skirts, reported her every movement, every word, every sigh. They watched her unravel and took notes. At night, sleep teased her but never stayed. She'd lie awake and replay conversations. Had she been too bold, too honest, too proud? She thought of Elizabeth left behind, a child of 2 dynasties now branded illegitimate by the very man who once shattered kingdoms to bring her into the world. Anne had once imagined her daughter ruling. Now she feared she'd grow up hearing only the word bastard. The court moved without her. Those who once courted her favor vanished like fog. Their loyalties shifted overnight. Cromwell, the architect of this bloodless coup, maneuvered from behind velvet curtains. The nobles, even her own kin, aligned themselves with survival. The same men who toasted her at banquets now dined on her downfall. Anne began to speak to herself. Not madness, ritual. Words were her weapon. Her prayers grew longer, her tone sharper. She whispered names under her breath. Names of men who betrayed her, names of women who smiled as the crown was lifted from her head. She rehearsed her innocence like scripture, not because she thought it would save her, but because it reminded her she had once been heard. There were moments she cried, not for herself, but for the absurdity, that a queen could be destroyed by silence and suggestion, that a king could love you one day and erase you the next, that the same hands that placed the crown on your head could later sign your death with ink still wet. She was allowed to write letters. She wrote to Henry once. It was a letter that trembled with reason and desperation, a plea not for life but for understanding. No answer came. Perhaps it was never delivered. Perhaps he read it and set it aside, his conscience already buried beneath ambition and Jane Seymour's pale promises. Each morning, she woke unsure if this would be the day. The guards said nothing. The sun rose slowly, painting the room in a pale blue she had grown to hate. Her meals came untouched. Her appetite evaporated. Her hands, once manicured and kissed, now shook when she laced her gown. And yet, she remained regal. Even in isolation, she forced herself to walk upright, to compose herself, to pray aloud. Her mind, though battered, refused to surrender fully. If they were going to break her, they would have to watch it happen, piece by piece. In the final days, a strange clarity settled in. The noise fell away. She no longer imagined rescue, no longer dreamed of reconciliation. She understood now. This was not about justice, it never was. It was about rewriting the past before it could become the future. It was about ensuring that no one else ever dared rise as she had. Anne Boleyn, daughter of a knight, queen of a realm, prisoner of politics, sat in the quiet of her cell and understood at last. The tower wasn't just stone and mortar. It was memory. And in its cold, echoless halls, they weren't just killing a woman. They were trying to kill the idea of her. The words came like blades, delivered not with fury, but with precision. Adultery, incest, treason. They echoed through the halls of Whitehall and Westminster like a funeral bell tolling not just for a woman, but for the truth itself. Anne Boleyn, once the Queen of England, was being recast as something far more useful, a warning. No one believed the charges. Not really. Not those who had seen her rise, not those who had dined at her table, whispered with her behind veils at court, laughed at her sharp tongue or wilted under her stare. But belief was irrelevant. This was not a trial. It was a message written in the blood of reputation. And Thomas Cromwell was the man holding the quill. Cromwell had once been her ally. He had cheered her rise because it aligned with his reformist ambition. But now he needed her gone. She had become too unpredictable, too involved, too loud in the wrong corridors and too silent in the ones that mattered. She argued policy. She questioned revenues. She threatened his grip on Henry. And so he did what all masters of power do. He constructed a narrative sharp enough to draw blood without touching a blade. The plan was elegant in its brutality. She would be accused not just of betrayal, but of desecration, not merely of the king's bed, but of the very sanctity of the crown. Cromwell understood something about human nature that made him deadly. People don't need evidence. They need spectacle. And Anne, with her foreign airs and proud posture, had always made the perfect target. Mark Smeaton confessed first. A musician, not a nobleman. Vulnerable, isolated. They squeezed him, perhaps with threats, perhaps with pain. His words, extracted like teeth, opened the floodgates. Once one man admitted to bedding the Queen, the court no longer needed truth. It needed continuity. Names were added. Norris, Weston, Brereton, her brother, George Boleyn, incest, a word that chilled the marrow, invented not to convict her but to unmake her completely. The public, so easily stirred, was fed a careful diet of outrage. Rumors, seeded in alehouses and repeated in market stalls, grew wild. The Queen had bewitched the king. She had lured men to her chamber like a harlot cloaked in jewels. She had laughed as Henry suffered. Some said she danced with lovers while Elizabeth lay in her cradle. None of it was real, but all of it was useful. Pamphlets began to circulate. Quiet whispers turned into public disgust. Women who once modeled themselves on Anne's French gowns now muttered prayers against her name. Her intelligence, once praised, became arrogance. Her charm, now evidence of seduction. The same men who had fought to be seen at her side now called her a traitor over wine and roast meat. Henry said nothing. He let the storm swell, and in his silence the court learned to speak the new language of power. Align with Jane Seymour. Distance yourself from the Queen. Rehearse shock at the accusations. Pretend the affair had taken you by surprise. Feign heartbreak, but not enough to question the outcome. Anne's name, once a symbol of transformation, became a dagger. Henry used it as both excuse and justification. He hadn't erred in breaking from Rome, he insisted. He had been deceived by a serpent. Anne's execution would purify his conscience and validate his reign. She became his scapegoat for every doubt, every failing. Her fall would be his absolution. But Anne fought back in the only way left to her. She refused to confess. She refused to weep. She denied every charge with a queen's fury and a woman's pride. Her trial was not a chance for defense, it was theater. The verdict had already been etched in stone before she entered the chamber. The jury, hand-picked, the outcome, rehearsed. And yet, she stood before them unbowed. She addressed her judges not as a supplicant, but as a witness to her own erasure. She spoke plainly, with sorrow, not shame. She named her loyalty. She spoke of her child. She acknowledged no sin. Her words were calm, but they struck with force. And for a moment, just a moment, some in the room looked away. But power does not blink, it moves. The sentence came swiftly. Death by beheading. A French swordsman had been summoned, a strange courtesy, a calculated symbol. The blade would be clean, they promised, unlike her legacy. Anne returned to her prison with her fate sealed. Outside, the city stirred with quiet anticipation. Some whispered that she deserved it. Others wondered who might be next. But no one could deny what had happened. A queen was about to be publicly destroyed, not for what she had done, but for what she had dared to be. Too intelligent, too ambitious, too present in matters of state, too bold in a world that only tolerated women in silence. Anne Boleyn was not executed for adultery, or incest, or treason. She was executed because power, when threatened, needs a corpse. She began to oscillate between laughter and weeping, her emotions unraveling in fits and flares like an instrument slowly being tuned, then detuned, by unseen hands. One moment, Anne Boleyn stood in regal silence, chin lifted, eyes dry. The next, she was speaking to the air, answering questions no one had asked, clinging to phrases of scripture as if they were planks on a sinking ship. No queen had ever died like this. Not publicly. Not like a criminal. Not in the cold gaze of a court that had once bowed before her. Time bent strangely in the tower. The days crawled, but her fate accelerated. The executioner had been summoned before her sentence was even declared. The platform was being built before she could say goodbye. She was living her own funeral in reverse. First the grave, then the verdict. Anne knew what was coming. The guards didn't need to tell her. She could hear it in their silence, see it in the way they avoided her eyes, feel it in the hollow echo of each footstep outside her door. Even the stone seemed to breathe differently, as if the walls themselves anticipated blood. She began rehearsing her death like a play. Not with vanity, but with control. What she would wear, what she would say, how she would stand. There would be no stumbling, no screaming. If she were to be a spectacle, she would direct the final scene. Her last performance would not belong to Henry, or Cromwell, or the mob. It would belong to her. She chose a gown of dark gray damask, modest, dignified. It had once shimmered in candlelight when she danced at court. Now it would absorb the morning sun as she climbed the scaffold. She refused a veil. She would not hide. She would not go blind into the blade. She wrote letters, not of protest but of release. One to her daughter, whom she would never see again. One to Henry, who would never read it. One to God, whom she still hoped might. She confessed no sin. She asked no pardon. She prayed not for salvation, but for peace. They brought her a confessor. She spoke softly with him, nodding, smiling faintly. Then later, she burst into laughter when speaking to her ladies, telling them she would be out of their way soon. They tried not to cry. She told them not to be sad. She joked about her little neck, the phrase tumbling from her lips like a dare. Was it bravery, madness, or simply a soul too exhausted to weep any longer? No coffin had been prepared. There would be no grand procession, no mourning banners. The body of a queen would be packed into a common arrow chest, hastily acquired by a constable embarrassed by the oversight. But Anne knew this too. She understood that her legacy, not her body, would carry her forward. The scaffold was still under construction when the sun rose on May 19th. Workers hammered planks together while ravens circled overhead. The grass beneath the platform had already been blackened with the trampling feet of previous executions. The tower yard was silent, and yet it buzzed with expectation. Courtiers gathered not in mourning, but in morbid anticipation, curious to see how the once untouchable woman would fall. When they came for her, she was ready. Her gown was pressed, her hair was arranged, her face, though pale, was composed. She walked with steady feet, each step a refusal to collapse. The crowd parted before her. No one reached out. No one bowed. She mounted the scaffold slowly. It was smaller than she imagined. The wood creaked under her feet. The executioner stood quietly, his sword hidden behind his back. Not out of kindness, but to ensure the queen didn't flinch. The swordsman was French, imported, famous for precision. They said he prayed for her the night before. Anne turned to the crowd. Her voice didn't shake. She did not curse the king. She did not deny her sentence. She offered only obedience, the kind forced from a throat that knew resistance was useless. She thanked God. She asked for mercy on the king. She declared herself innocent, but forgave those who condemned her. Her words were scripted, but her voice was her own. The ladies attending her stepped forward. They removed her headdress, tucked her hair beneath a simple linen cap. Her neck was exposed, slender, pale, waiting. She knelt, not on a block, but upright, as the French tradition required. There would be no thud of axe against wood, only a whistle of air, a snap of muscle, and the hush that follows. She kept her hands folded, her eyes closed. Her lips whispered something only she and God would ever hear. The executioner whispered to his assistant to fetch the sword. Anne turned her head slightly, as if waiting for permission. The executioner gave a signal. He called out to distract her, "Bring me the sword!" And in that moment, while her head tilted slightly, while her lips parted just barely in confusion or hope, the blade flashed. It was over in an instant. But it wasn't. Her body crumpled forward. Her head rolled slightly to the side. For seconds, maybe more, her eyes blinked. Her mouth moved. Witnesses claimed her lips formed words. A prayer, a curse, a goodbye. No one knew. No one wanted to. The crowd exhaled as one. No trumpet sounded. No bell tolled. The body was wrapped in a sheet and placed into the arrow chest. The head was tucked beside it. The box was nailed shut. No ceremony. No procession. Just the scraping of wood on stone as they carried her to an unmarked grave. They did not bury a queen that day. They buried a problem. A question. A force that had risen too far. Spoken too loudly. Dreamed too openly. But Anne Boleyn did not die quietly. She choreographed her own end, and in doing so, she ensured that the performance would never truly fade. He had arrived days earlier, quietly, without fanfare. The French executioner, anonymous to history, deliberate in purpose. Chosen not for mercy, but for efficiency. He was a swordsman, not an axeman. A master of precision, not brute force. It was said he had executed noblewomen before, aristocracy that demanded elegance in their erasure. And now he had come to England, summoned to perform the final act in a royal tragedy dressed up as justice. Why a foreign blade? Why a stranger's hand? Because Henry VIII wanted distance. An English executioner might flinch, might hesitate, might be seen as complicit in a spectacle that would stain the monarchy. But a Frenchman, he had no loyalties, no history with Anne, no stake in her story. He would come, perform, and vanish. A ghost with a sword. The court called it a mercy. Swifter than an axe, they said. More dignified. But Anne understood what it really was. This wasn't about kindness. It was about control. A clean death meant less blood, less screaming, less chaos, and most of all, less time. Less time for second thoughts. Less time for eyes to lock. Less time for those watching to feel anything human. Anne was not given a block to rest upon. That was the French method. She would kneel upright, hands folded, neck exposed. The blade would come from behind, not in front, not above. No dramatic raising of the axe. Just one silent step, one breathless motion, and it would be done. Blindfolded, she would not see the sword. Not the shine of steel, not the movement of the man who would end her life. It was said to be more peaceful that way, but Anne knew the blindfold was not for her comfort. It was for theirs, for the crowd, for the king. To hide the truth in its final moment, to make it easier to believe that justice had been done rather than witnessed. On the scaffold, the executioner knelt before her. He asked her forgiveness. A ritual, yes, but one that mattered. Anne granted it with a nod, her voice steady. "I pray God save the king," she said again, the words tasting of ashes. "He is ever a good and gentle sovereign lord." Her blindfold was tied carefully, tight enough to shut out light, loose enough to let her breathe. In the dark, Anne was left with only sound, the rustle of fabric, the creak of timber beneath her knees, the slow, rhythmic pounding of her own heart. And then, nothing. Silence, so thick it buzzed in the ears. The crowd held its breath. The wind stopped. Even the tower ravens seemed to pause in their circles. The executioner gave a signal to his assistant, a slight nod. Then, in a move rehearsed countless times, he stepped lightly to his left, raising the sword out of her peripheral. He whispered in French, not to her, but as a distraction, "Where's my sword?" Anne's head turned slightly, instinctively, searching for the voice. That was the moment. Steel sang through air. The blade didn't thud or crash. It hissed, a swift arc, a slice too fast to register. Bone and sinew severed in a single perfect motion. Her body collapsed forward, knees folding beneath her. Her head dropped silently into the straw. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Not screams, not wails, just that involuntary sound of realization. It was over. Blood darkened the wood. The scent of iron filled the air. The swordsman stepped back, bowed, and waited. There was no applause, no declaration, just the silence of an audience unsure what they had witnessed. A woman becoming a symbol, a queen becoming a ghost. The blindfold remained in place. Her eyes never reopened. Her last sight had been sky, gray, featureless, endless. Her last breath, caught in the stillness between accusation and annihilation. The French executioner's job was done. He would be paid and returned across the channel. His name forgotten, his presence erased. But the blade, the memory of it, that would remain, not just as a tool of death, but as a symbol of precision and cruelty. Of a monarchy that could script murder as ritual. of a king so entangled in his own myth that only a foreign sword could cleanly sever the lie from the legend. Anne Boleyn died by steel, yes, but she was killed by silence. The sword struck clean, but it did not bring immediate stillness. For a few long, impossible seconds, Anne Boleyn existed in a space between death and life. Her body had collapsed, yes, folded neatly like cloth at the base of the scaffold, but her head did not die as swiftly as the crown she had once worn. Witnesses claimed they saw her eyes move, open, blink, search. Some said her lips formed words, faint and soundless, still praying to the God who hadn't intervened. Others saw her mouth stretch in a final expression, pain, peace, or perhaps disbelief. The human mind, even in death, often refuses to let go quietly. One of her ladies-in-waiting fainted on the spot. Another turned away, clutching a crucifix so tightly it drew blood. But most of the crowd remained frozen, as if their collective breath had been held in suspense, only now realizing the scene was not yet complete. Decapitation they had expected, but consciousness after the blade? That was something else. That was horror. 30 seconds. That's all it takes for oxygen to stop feeding the brain. 30 seconds of dim awareness. 30 seconds for a soul to linger in the cage of flesh, looking for an escape it has already found. Anne's head lay in the straw, her blood soaking through it in rivulets, but her mouth still twitched, some said in prayer, some said in protest. And that's where the true humiliation began. Not in the execution itself, but in what followed. The once Queen of England was given no coffin, no royal shroud, no solemn procession. Instead, her remains were hastily gathered like refuse. Her body, now limp and stripped of dignity, was pushed into a used arrow chest, something meant to carry weapons of war, not queens. The chest had not been measured. Her limbs were folded unnaturally, jammed into the small space with hurried hands. Her head was placed beside her torso, wrapped loosely in linen. No ceremony, no final blessing, just wood scraping against wood as they nailed the lid shut with whatever nails were nearby. It was a burial not of grief, but of guilt. A few guards carried the chest down into the crypt of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church within the tower walls where traitors went to disappear. There was no official present, no prayer read aloud. The grave had already been dug, shallow, unmarked. No stone would bear her name. No inscription would tell of her reign. This too was part of the punishment. Erasure. They wanted her gone, not just dead. She was placed next to the remains of others who had been deemed inconvenient. Once allies, once rivals, now just bones, dust, warnings. Back on the scaffold, the crowd began to disperse, slowly, silently. The space she left behind felt colder than before, as if history itself had paused to absorb what had happened. A man swept the blood-soaked straw into a bucket. Another began to dismantle the scaffold plank by plank. The sun, which had risen so tentatively that morning, now blazed down without mercy, illuminating the place where a queen had been broken. And yet, something lingered. Anne's death was meant to be swift and clinical, a public display of power cleansed of emotion. But instead, it had revealed everything the court had tried to hide: fear, fragility, cruelty. The blade may have cut cleanly, but the wound it left behind in the soul of England would not close. The whispers started that very afternoon. That she had died bravely. That she had forgiven the king. That her spirit had been seen, walking the tower walls. The people did not speak her name in the marketplace, but they remembered. The execution, so carefully staged to erase her, had instead immortalized her. Anne Boleyn was gone, but she had not been silenced. Not by the blade, not by the box, not by the men who had buried her like a broken oath. The day after her execution, the court began a second, more permanent form of violence, one not aimed at flesh, but at legacy. The goal was not simply to end Anne Boleyn's life, but to rewrite her entirely, to make the woman vanish beneath the weight of myth, rumor, and institutional forgetting. Her portraits were the first to go. One by one, the likenesses once proudly displayed in royal chambers were removed and destroyed. Her dark eyes, sharp jawline, and signature French hood, symbols of her power, were no longer welcome. Her image was a liability, a reminder of disruption, seduction, rebellion. It had to be erased. A new queen would soon take her place, and there could be no trace of the woman who once wore the crown. Walls were stripped, canvases burned, names scratched from family records as if she had been a ghost all along. Then came the edicts. Elizabeth, her daughter, barely 3 years old, was declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament. Her royal status revoked, her title stripped. She was no longer heir, no longer princess. She was the shadow of a mistake. Anne's blood now stained her daughter's name, and the court made sure everyone understood. The sins of the mother would haunt the child. For a time, even her name was spoken cautiously, an echo too dangerous to repeat in full. Henry remarried swiftly. Jane Seymour. Blonde, quiet, obedient. The opposite of Anne in every way that mattered. She was presented as the rightful queen, the healer of a broken monarchy. Her portraits were painted in gold and ivory, her smile subtle, submissive. She was exactly what Anne had never been allowed to be, harmless. The official narrative was reshaped overnight. Anne was now framed not as a tragic figure but as a cautionary one. She had been a temptress, a witch, a disruptor of the divine order. Whispers of her many lovers returned with venom. Some said she had cast spells, others that she had cursed the king's seed, explaining his lack of a male heir. Her intelligence, once praised, became dangerous ambition. Her influence over Henry, once seen as romantic, became evidence of corruption. The sermons began. Priests warned of women who overreached, who dared to speak in political matters or counsel kings. Anne became a parable, proof of what happens when a woman forgets her place. Even those who had once praised her for her wit and grace now referred to her in hushed tones, eyes lowered, voices clipped. And so, a queen who had helped reshape a nation was reduced to a caricature. Not by truth, but by decree. The crown needed her gone not just in body, but in history. And the state knows how to erase. It silences not with swords, but with ink. With silence. With the rewriting of records, the redaction of names, the deliberate act of forgetting. Monuments are built to memory, but so too are graves of the mind, places where people are buried not with stones but with shame. Anne's friends were watched. Some fled, others bent with the wind, pretending they had never supported her. Her enemies flourished. Cromwell tightened his grip. Henry celebrated his freedom, dancing at court while Anne's blood was still drying beneath the scaffold. The tower was cleaned, the arrow chest buried, the blindfold discarded. And yet, something resisted. Letters survived, portraits hidden, memories passed in whispers. Anne's story didn't die, it went underground. Among women especially, her name became a question more than a warning. What was she really like? What did she say before she died? Was it true? Those questions turned into stories. Stories turned into myths. And myths, if told long enough, outlived the lies of kings. Elizabeth would grow up beneath the shadow of her mother's disgrace, but she would carry that name, Boleyn, like armor. She would inherit Anne's defiance, her cunning, her refusal to be forgotten. and one day she would return to the very palace where her mother had been condemned and rule it absolutely. The state had tried to kill the queen twice, once in the body, then in the memory. But Anne Boleyn had been a woman too complex, too dangerous, too unforgettable to be buried in silence. They rewrote her, but they could not erase her. She died in silence but lived on in whispers, then stories, then storms. Anne Boleyn's execution was meant to be an ending, a brutal punctuation mark in a king's reign of desire and paranoia. But instead, it became a beginning, the beginning of a legacy too vast, too fractured, too human to ever be buried beneath stone or lies. They could not control how history would remember her, because history, when given time, starts listening to what power tried to silence. Anne became myth almost immediately. The Tower Green, where she died, never felt quite the same. Guards spoke of strange chills, of flickering torches, and shifting shadows. Some swore they saw her, headless, gliding silently in the moonlight. Others simply refused to go near the scaffold at night. Whether apparition or anxiety, the echoes of her end never stopped ringing from the cobblestones. Over the centuries, she morphed into something larger than her crown, a feminist icon before the word existed, a symbol of intellect punished, of ambition branded as seduction, of a woman who refused to play silent. To many, she was England's Eve, both blamed and exalted for a fall she never truly authored. Artists returned to her face, painting and repainting what they thought she looked like. Writers tried to capture her fire in ink. Historians debated whether she was guilty, saintly, cunning, naive, but the facts began to matter less than the resonance, because what made Anne unforgettable wasn't simply how she died, it was what her death revealed. She had stood at the center of an empire's transformation. She wasn't just Henry's wife, she was the catalyst of England's break with Rome, the mother of its most iconic queen, the reason thrones shifted, bloodlines changed, and a nation rewrote itself in defiance of the church. And all of that made her dangerous even in death. The crown had tried to turn her into a cautionary tale, but people began to see something else, not a fallen woman, but a betrayed one, not a villainess, but a victim, not just a queen, but a warning about power's hunger, a warning about how the state breaks those who challenge it, a warning about how easily a woman's voice is twisted into a weapon and then used against her. They scrubbed her from portraits, but she returned to art. They silenced her words, but they became quotes. They buried her body without grace, but could not bury the question, why did she have to die? And perhaps that is the real reason her story endures. Because her death was not just tragic, it was unjust, and injustice, when seen clearly, becomes immortal. Anne Boleyn is more than a Tudor footnote. She is a mirror, held up to every era that still fears a woman who dares to think, to speak, to challenge. They tried to erase her, but she became a warning.